Tariffs can be seen as a special type of sales tax on goods, applied exclusively to imported products and paid by firms. The tariff burden on consumers is the share of the tariff that consumers pay. In other words, it is how much of the tariff is passed on to consumers. It equals the change in the market price of the good divided by the amount of the tariff. I call it alpha. The tariff burden on firms equals 1 minus the tariff burden on consumers. For example, if a tariff of $1 is imposed on an imported good and the market price of that good rises by 50 cents, meaning that consumers have to pay 50 cents more, then the tariff burden on consumers, alpha, is 0.5, indicating that half of the tariff is passed on to consumers. We use a supply and demand curve graph to analyze the tariff burden sharing. The consumer's demand curve for good and the firm supply curve for that good are plotted on a graph where the horizontal axis represents quantity and the vertical axis represents price. Holding other factors constant, consumer demand for good generally decreases as price increases, meaning that demand and price move in opposite directions. As a result, the demand curve slows downward. On the contrary, firms increase the supply of a good as its price rises, meaning that supply and price move in the same direction, causing the supply curve to slope upward. Market equilibrium, E, is determined at the intersection of the demand and supply curves. At this equilibrium, firms sell the good at the equilibrium price P star, and consumers purchase the equilibrium quantity Q star at that price. Next, we analyze how tariffs change market equilibrium. Using imported strawberries as an example, a tariff of $T is levied per kilogram of strawberries. The tariff burden on consumers is measured by the price change caused by the tariff relative to the tariff itself. Tariffs lead to an increase in supply costs, causing the supply curve to shift upward. This shift occurs because, for any given quantity supplied, firms must charge a higher price to cover the increased costs. As a result, the market equilibrium shifts from E1 to E2. The equilibrium price rises from P1 to P2, while the equilibrium quantity decreases from Q1 to Q2. That is to say, tariffs cause an increase in the price of strawberries and a decrease in the quantity purchased. We can reach our first conclusion about tariffs. Tariffs lead to higher market prices for the imported good and a decline in the quantity purchased. However, the price increase, delta P, is smaller than the tariff T. The price rises from P1 to P2, but the increase, delta P, is only a fraction of the tariff T. In other words, the consumer's tariff burden ratio, alpha, falls between 0 and 1. For instance, if alpha equals 0.5, then the price increase is half of the tariff, meaning that consumers bear half of the tariff. The larger alpha is, the closer the price increase is to the full tariff amount, and the greater the consumer burden. What determines the tariff burden on consumers? It is closely related to the price elasticities of demand and supply curves. In the graph, price elasticity is represented by the shape and slope of the curves. The steeper the demand curve and the flatter the supply curve, the higher the tariff burden on consumers, as shown in this graph. The tariff-induced price increase, delta P, is large, nearly reaching the full tariff T. By contrast, if the demand curve is flat and the supply curve is steep, consumers bear a smaller proportion of the tariff, as shown in this graph. We can mathematically prove that the tariff burden on consumers, alpha, is a fraction containing both the price elasticity of demand and the price elasticity of supply. The numerator is supply elasticity, while the denominator is supply elasticity minus demand elasticity. At the end of the video, I provide a mathematical derivation of the formula. Here, I give the definitions of price elasticities of demand and supply. Economists use the concept of price elasticity of demand to measure how the quantity demanded of a good responds to changes in prices. Price elasticity of demand is calculated as the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price. For example, if the price of a good increases by 1%, causing the quantity demanded to decrease by 2%, the price elasticity of demand is -2. The minus sign indicates the opposite direction of the demand and the price changes. Similarly, price elasticity of supply measures how the quantity supplied of a good responds to price changes. It is calculated as the percentage change in quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in price. For example, if the price of a good rises by 1%, leading to a 2% increase in quantity supplied, the price elasticity of supply is 2. Generally speaking, the price elasticity of demand is negative, while the price elasticity of supply is positive. Returning to the tariff burden on consumers, alpha, the numerator is positive. The denominator is also positive, as it is the sum of the absolute values of the price elasticity of supply and the price elasticity of demand. Alpha falls between 0 and 1. Now, we discuss several scenarios. The first scenario considers a case where the price elasticity of supply is large while the price elasticity of demand is relatively small. A high supply elasticity means the quantity supplied responds significantly to price changes. Even a small price increase leads to a substantial rise in supply, meaning that the supply curve is very flat. A low demand elasticity means demand is not very sensitive to price changes. The price must drop significantly to cause even a small increase in demand, meaning that the demand curve is very steep. This corresponds to our first graph. In this scenario, the tariff burden on consumers, alpha, is close to 1, meaning that consumers bear most of the tariff, while firms take on only a small portion of it. The second scenario considers a case where the price elasticity of supply is small, while the price elasticity of demand is relatively large. Alpha is close to 0, meaning that consumers bear only a small portion of the tariff, while firms absorb most of the burden. This corresponds to the second graph. Why is the tariff shared between consumers and firms? Since tariffs increase supply costs, firms have to raise the price of goods. Faced with higher prices, consumers reduce their purchases. The decline in demand imposes downward pressure on prices, restricting their increase. The interaction between consumers and firms ensures that the market price of the good reaches a new equilibrium. We arrive at the second conclusion about tariffs. The burden of tariffs is shared between firms and consumers, which is determined by the price elasticities of demand and supply. The party with relatively lower price elasticity bears a greater portion of the tariff. Is it possible for firms to bear the entire tariff burden? Yes, but only in extreme cases. In such cases, the tariff burden on consumers equals 0. This occurs only when the price elasticity of supply is 0, or the price elasticity of demand approaches negative infinity. A 0 price elasticity of supply corresponds to a vertical supply curve, meaning that the quantity supplied does not respond to price changes. Since the supply of the good is fixed, firms cannot pass the tariff burden on to consumers, as doing so would risk a decline in demand and unsold products. Although tariffs increase production costs, the market equilibrium remains unchanged, resulting in no change in market price. Consequently, consumers bear no portion of the tariff burden. An example of this scenario would be perishable agricultural products that cannot be stored, such as imported bananas. An infinite price elasticity of demand corresponds to a horizontal demand curve, meaning that even a tiny price increase would cause demand to vanish instantly. In this case, sellers must absorb the full tariff and fail to raise prices, as doing so would result in a complete loss of sales. An example would be a market with many identical substitute goods, such as imported beverages, where consumers can easily switch to alternatives if their price rises. as long as the imported good is not a highly perishable, non-storable item that quickly loses its value, or consumers cannot find perfect substitutes for the imported good, firms will not bear the entire tariff burden. Consumers will inevitably face higher prices and shoulder part of the tariff. Can the entire tariff be passed on to consumers? Yes, but also only in extreme cases. In such cases, the tariff burden on consumers equals 1. From the formula, we know that alpha equals 1 only when the price elasticity of supply goes to infinity or the price elasticity of demand is 0. An infinite price elasticity of supply corresponds to a horizontal supply curve. The tariff increases the price of the good. The good is supplied at the new price. But if the price drops below that level, supply immediately falls to 0. Consumers must fully absorb the price increase caused by the tariff. A zero price elasticity of demand corresponds to a vertical demand curve. Consumers are highly dependent on the good, meaning that regardless of the price changes, they continue purchasing the same quantity. An example would be patients requiring specific medications, where demand remains unchanged even if prices increase. In this case, the entire tariff burden is shifted onto consumers, as their consumption does not decrease in response to price hikes. All factors that influence the price elasticity of demand or price elasticity of supply will alter the distribution of tariff burdens. These factors include whether it is easy for consumers to find substitutes for the imported goods. If consumers can easily find substitutes, even a slight price increase in imported goods will lead them to switch to alternatives. In this case, the price elasticity of demand for imported goods is high, resulting in a very flat demand curve. This corresponds to scenario 2, where the price of imported goods rises only slightly, and consumers bear a small portion of the tariff burden. Conversely, if substitutes for imported goods are scarce, consumers must continue purchasing the product despite its price increase. In this case, the price elasticity of demand is low, resulting in a steep price curve. This corresponds to scenario 1, where the market price of the imported good rises significantly, and consumers bear a larger portion of the tariff burden. Whether imported goods are basic necessities. If an imported good is a necessity, its demand curve is almost vertical, meaning that demand remains fixed regardless of price changes. In this case, consumers bear almost the full burden of the tariff, as they have no choice but to continue purchasing the product, such as the medicines we just mentioned. Another example is gasoline, which is a basic necessity for many people. The price elasticity of demand is more because the quantity demanded changes slightly with respect to the change in gas price. By contrast, if the imported good is not a necessity, consumers can choose not to buy it when the price increases. For example, consumers will stop purchasing the luxuries, like very expensive handbags, when their prices rise. For the luxuries, consumers bear little burden of tariffs. Production flexibility. If firms that produce the imported goods can easily adjust production levels, supply tends to be more elastic, which leads to a higher tariff burden on consumers. If firms struggle to reduce production under tariff pressure, the supply of imported goods becomes inelastic, causing firms to bear a larger portion of the tariff burden. Time horizon matters. Goods tend to have more elastic demand over longer time horizons. For example, studies show that a 10% increase in gasoline prices reduces gasoline consumption by about 2.5% after a year and by about 6% after 5 years. That is because it takes time for people to adjust their lifestyles. In the long run, people drive less and switch to more fuel-efficient cars. Today, we discuss the effects of tariffs on imported goods, market prices, and quantities. And we consider how the tariff is split between consumers and firms. We have reached 3 conclusions. First, tariffs lead to a higher market price for the imported good and a decline in the quantity purchased. Second, the burden of tariffs is shared between firms and consumers, which is determined by the price elasticities of demand and supply. The relatively more inelastic party bears a greater portion of the tariff. Third, the factors behind the tariff burden on consumers include the availability of close substitutes, whether the imported good is a basic necessity, production flexibility, and the time horizon. Tariffs have a profound impact on our lives and affect many things. Many of them are beyond the field of microeconomics and my scope of knowledge. I just provided an introduction from the perspective of microeconomics. I hope it will encourage further discussion and research. Thank you very much. See you soon. Take care. Thank you for watching this video and subscribing to my YouTube channel. See you next time.